Hello and welcome back to the Scenario 7 podcast. My name is Sam, and as always, I'm joined by my lovely co-hosts, Josh Bacon and Joe Roberts. How are you two doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Sam. How are yourself?
I'm good, mate. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing good, thank you. I'm doing good.
That's good to hear. And this week we're here for a Netherlands Grand Prix review, Zandvoort the track, and I don't know, it's had a mixed response from the race today. I personally enjoyed it, but guys, I want to get your reaction. What did you think generally about the race before we go into a bit more detail?
Josh, do you want to go?
I was going to let you go, Joe, because you've got such strong views on.
Oh yeah, I was going to say if you because you might have some modest views. I didn't particularly like. I like the track, as in I think it's a very good qualifying track, as in we'll talk about later. But as a race track, it's pretty awful, and it seemed that we only got like 8 overtakes in 72 laps. I think the only thing that made the race a race, it was the fans being there, as in it was up there with potentially being more passionate fans than Britain. But again, I think with the British Grand Prix, you got multiple different factions in the whole around the whole of the track that support different teams. But in the Netherlands, Zandvoort was like all Max fans. But yeah, it apparently, from what they're saying from like Sky and that, it was electric, the atmosphere. So for me, that was the reason it made it a race. I think if it didn't have the fans, it would have been pretty boring, and yeah, I didn't particularly like it.
I can see why he says that. When he said the 8 overtakes in 72 laps, I think all 8 of them by one driver. But we'll forget about that. But I think what kind of made it more, maybe not exciting but interesting, was the different strategies that each driver or team were going for. So obviously some with 1 stop, 2 stop. I think there might have been a few 3 stops as well. But I think that was the only reason that kind of made it interesting. Because the track's not very good for overtakes, except for coming out of the first corner and possibly some of the other DRS zone. But I think I'm in slight agreement with Joe, but I do agree. I think I'm in more to the other side of it was interesting, just not exciting.
Yeah, I think to be honest, I didn't mind it too much. I think it could have been a lot worse, because a lot of the people going into it were saying there's going to be no overtaking and it's just going to be boring. And to be honest, I think there was a fair share of overtakes. I mean, 8 overtakes, you're just being dramatic, Joe, because Perez went from the pits to 8th. So that's like quite a few on his own. And then you had Alonso gained a few places. You had Norris, who gained a few places. So there was definitely some overtaking.
Whoa. Norris?
They were going through the pit
Norris
stops.
overtook only Ricciardo.
That's an overtake. It doesn't really matter.
Got let through. You can't see even Hamilton and Bottas letting overtaking as an overtake.
I mean...
And Alonso was on the first lap.
No, I did on the last lap.
Last lap as well. Few bits that got an overtake on the last lap as well. So there was overtaking. You're being too harsh. Verstappen also overtook Bottas, so that was an overtake at the front. Admittedly, Bottas was on much harder tyres, and Verstappen definitely had the pace advantage, but I don't think it was that bad. I really enjoyed the atmosphere. I think that made it great, as you said, Joe. And as quali was great, so that added a lot to it. So overall, I think the weekend, I'd say, was good. The race was all right, but I think for the first race in Holland since 1985, I'd argue that it was a big success. But let's talk about quali, first of all, starting with Q1. So the main talking points from Q1 was, of course, 2 big surprises with Sergio Perez and Sebastian Vettel not making it through. Sergio Perez didn't start his lap in time because he was sent out too late from his mechanics, and because of traffic, so he couldn't get round. And then you had Sebastian Vettel, whose lap was compromised by the Haas drivers. So the first question I want to pose to you guys is, do you think the Sebastian Vettel incident was enough to get a penalty? Because in the end, the stewards deemed that there wasn't really much the Haas could do because there was a massive queue anyway. And to be honest, they qualified last and second to last anyway. So it didn't really matter. But yeah, do you guys think it was a penalty?
Well, I think if it was anyone else, it probably would have been. And I think in previous races, it's happened and a penalty was awarded. So just the fact that it was the Hasses who are just at the back of the grid, just it shouldn't change how they apply the rules to each team. So I personally think, and I thought it should have been a penalty to, I think it was Mick for pulling out. But not thankfully, but if you listen to the radio afterwards, he was quite emotional about realizing it was Seb behind him. He was like just blocking his mate from completing a lap. But I think it's happened in previous and other circuits and other tracks. So I think there should have been a penalty rewarded to the Haas there.
Yeah, I agree with Josh. I think the Haas should get a penalty, but I don't think what penalty can you actually do unless you just fine them, which I think is I think there's a massive problem in F1 to do with qualifying, people backing up in the pits, which I found really stupid, and also then backing up ridiculously in the last sector. I think it was, I remember during qualifying that Ricciardo was starting his lap, but he was halfway round until like I think the fourth or fifth driver come out the pits. This is like in Q3, I think. So it is a massive problem because you're going to end up, I don't know, having massive accident. Luckily, there wasn't with Vettel and Mazepin. I think it was Mazepin and Schumacher. But it is getting a bit ridiculous. I don't know what the FIA can do about it, but there's something they need to do in order to make it safe, especially around a twisty circuit, because it's good. As in, like next week in Monza, it's going to be a massive problem because people just want slipstream.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially frustrating from Sebastian Vettel's point of view because he was on a hot lap and he literally he was so close to hitting the Haas, so he had to really pull out a lot. So he was never going to make it through to Q2. So that certainly implies that a penalty should have perhaps been given to the Haas because they were both squabbling over position. They were squabbling on the radio about whose go it was to go first in quali. And it's definitely getting quite toxic there, but perhaps penalty points on their license. But I'm not really sure. The stewards gave an interesting explanation, and I don't think that was too bad. So it's an interesting one, but let's move on to Q2, where, again, the talking points here are another driver that you don't expect to be going out in Q2, and that is Lando Norris, of course, as he couldn't get another lap in. This time it's not because of traffic, but because of the two Williams sabotaging him. Obviously, someone had paid them to make sure Lando Norris didn't get into Q3, as George Russell hit the wall. To be fair, continued back to the pits, but that caused a red flag due to debris. And then Nicholas Latifi just decided, you know what, I've just been so inspired by George that he's going to do it, but like 10 times harder, and absolutely slams in the wall, destroying his car. And the stewards then were like, we've had enough. We're just going to stop the session, which, to be honest, I feel like they should have kept going because there was a minute 35 left, I think, if I remember correctly, on the clock. And it takes about 1 minute 14 on a normal lap on the race, but around that time to do a lap. So I definitely think that maybe not with backing up, but I think they could have got round to do another lap. Do you think that the stewards should have just moved on to Q3, or do you think they should have given them a chance with the 1 minute 35 left?
I agree with what the FIA did, even though it unfortunately didn't mean Lando could go any further. But with the 1 minute 35 left, if you think about it, when they start the time, it's literally starting from as they're at the pit lane. So they could be there waiting at the pit exit, or they could be in the garage. By the time they've gone out of the pits and started going round, that's probably like a minute 20. So I reckon maybe 1 or 2 cars would have got there because they would have still backed up, so they had the space to do the lap. So it wouldn't have been worth it. So I think they made the right decision.
Yeah, I agree with Josh on that.
Yeah, no, it's fair enough. It's just something I wanted to bring up because I was looking at it. I mean, I didn't see the qualifying at the time. I was watching the highlights, and I was thinking perhaps that because job and that. But and I was thinking perhaps that they could have done it. But let's move on to Q3. Not as eventful as Q1 or Q2, but I think the highlight of Q3 was Giovinazzi qualifying in 7th with one hell of a lap in that Alfa Romeo. Did fantastically, qualifying ahead of Ocon, Alonso and Ricciardo, who are no mugs. I mean, all of them have race wins between them. Ricciardo, excellent for Red Bull, not having a great time McLaren. Alonso's a world champion and Ocon is a rising star. So Giovinazzi qualifying 7th was massive. But the problem with Giovinazzi is it's never been his quali pace that's been the issue. It's always been his race pace. And as we'll talk about later, his race pace just wasn't good enough. And we put the question in the preview about whether Giovinazzi should keep his seat. And I just want to pose it early, after qualifying 7th, which is brilliant, but I don't think you could take away the shine on that. Do you think that he should keep his seat and this performance was good enough for him to keep it, or do you think that he was completely let down by the race?
I'm going to be quite blunt with you here, as in, I know you're a massive Giovinazzi fan, but I honestly don't think he'll be in F1. I don't think 7th in round Netherlands saves his seat, because the fact is the evolving track, because of how not very many categories I think were on the day, set from F3 and then the women's series and then the Porsche Cup. So I don't think 7th would change anything, because the evolving track, and then even Williams, Latifi got into Q2, and some of his qualifying, I think from that he's been in out of Q1 quite a lot, and his race pace is awful, and I think if you look at the pool of drivers out there, I think there are better drivers. For example, Alex Albon, Valtteri Bottas, even like Nico Hulkenberg, like even Nick de Vries. As in, there's a number of drivers. Even I don't know who's going to win the F2 championship that could go into Alfa Romeo, and then obviously Paul Chair as well. So for me, I think your hope of him staying in the seat is going to be, I think, not particularly hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you both. I think, but it's just his consistency. He doesn't perform at a consistent level. So, like, obviously, you got P7 in qualifying this weekend, but then like a few weekends ago, he'll be like P14 or something lower like that. But then with today's race, he wasn't quick, but did also get a bit unlucky, because I think he had a puncture, which means he had to do an extra pit stop. But still, he didn't have the pace to then catch up and keep going. But I think he just hasn't shown enough that he can compete at a decent level or a consistent level. So I think it is probably the right decision for Alfa Romeo to find someone else and move him on.
Yeah, I mean, you say every time I pose a question about a driver, you always say, "Oh, you love that guy." I mean, he is the Italian Jesus, but I don't love him. I don't love him that much. I'm just posing the question because he did great in qualifying, and we should talk about that because he's not had the most consistent season. So it's good to highlight people when they do better than they normally do. But yeah, let's. Breaking down the race, not much really happened. I mean, pre-race, you had Latifi and Perez starting for the pits. Latifi pits because fixed his car, and Perez starting the pits because he changed his engine. In terms of what happened, in terms of highlights, flashpoints, lap 34, George Russell got a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pits, which you only really see on the F1 2020-2021 game. I haven't seen that in F1 for years. Lap 44, Mazepin retired with a hydraulic problem. Lap 50, Tsunoda retired with an engine problem. And lap 71, Russell retired with a problem which Williams haven't come out with. No red flags. What happened? We were predicting like chaos on Sunday. There wasn't a safety car. There wasn't a yellow. There wasn't a red flag, and there was only one double waved yellow. I mean, how was there not a red flag, guys? Like how?
I think everyone was just playing it a little bit safe because obviously, like Joe said towards the beginning, they didn't think now that many overtakes, so people just didn't want to put it in a position where they didn't feel comfortable to. Especially around that turn 3 hairpin where loads of people were just taking the high line and didn't want to risk going down the low line. I think Ocon did it once against Alonso and then obviously backed off because there's no space. So I think it's a mixture of people. Drivers weren't brave enough to make moves because they didn't want to then ruin their chances of getting points. But then also I think once they got into their groove and they found their line, it's just pretty simple. Just drive around the track for 72 laps and just keep it there. I think only Vettel made a mistake where he caused a double yellows on turn 3, but other than that, I think that's why there were no other safety cars or red flags.
Yeah, it's a bit like scale electrics, as in if as soon as you get off that line, only Ocon made. I think it looked like only made it able to make it stick on that low side, as Vettel suddenly deviated off the tracks, as it were, in scale electrics. But yeah, as in it was, I don't know, as in again, I think it was people, again, as Josh said, people not taking risk, but also the way I think Lewis Hamilton said that you get dirty air with 6 seconds if you're behind a car in 6 seconds, which means because the amount of people that for example, the top 2, we'll probably talk about them more in depth, but if they keep on overtaking lap cars, the dirty air is going to affect Lewis Hamilton more because he has to overtake all of them. And it's, I don't know, for me, it was literally people being, again, cautious, but also the fact is that no cars could get into a rhythm because every time they got near anybody, they got dirty air and had to basically sit back and get away from basically damaging their tires and getting punctures. But also I think people just got used to the track, so they just didn't make mistakes, because I think it was like 5 or 6 red flags in practice and qualifying. So yeah, it was just it was just people getting used to the track, and I think they got used to the track in the race.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I guess in qualifying you are properly going flat out, and you are risking a lot more than the race where you can be more conservative to save tyres, you said. And let's move on to going through a team-by-team breakdown, talking about who did well, who didn't, starting with the big boys, Mercedes and Red Bull. So for Mercedes, they got the most points this weekend, despite not winning the race, with Hamilton coming second and getting fastest lap, and Bottas coming third. That's compared to Red Bull's 29 points. Mercedes got 34. Verstappen winning, coming first, but Perez coming eighth. But considering where he started, he still do well. How do you compare the team's fortunes over the weekend? I mean, Verstappen was, I'd argue, dominant. I mean, Hamilton did all he could and made him sweat, but Verstappen was dominant. But Mercedes still come out on top in the constructors. So how do you guys break down the battle between the two teams?
Perez was very poor in qualifying and then good in the race. As in, the reason I say that, if you're in the best car, you're against a Haas, a Williams, and Alfa Romeo, you should get round them. I think when you get to the cars like the McLaren, yes, it was a good move, and then also basically forced himself with Lando Norris. It's cars that you should get round, and also he was on the softs. But yeah, it's and are we talking about Mercedes now?
Yeah, talking about both the teams.
Oh, both teams, and then Max, was dominant. I think Lewis could have got him on qualifying to pole if he knew. I think if he got his first sector a lot better. I think he made a mistake into I think turn 3, or I can't remember the number, the corner number. But Bottas is the one I think probably have to talk about it. Very interesting that he nearly set the fastest lap with 2 laps to go. I thought it was quite cheeky from him. But overall, I think it was compromised by Vettel's mini spin because he had to lock his tyres up, and then basically the tyre window for that tyre is completely shot. So then he's basically struggling for the whole of the stint afterwards. And then Hamilton just pushed Max all the way, and it will be a very fascinating season.
There we go.
Okay, that's okay. Oh my word, I'm confused now. Anyway, I think I agree and disagree with some of your points there, but I think in terms of qualifying, I disagree with the comment of Lewis being able to go faster than Max, because when you actually look at it, Max didn't have his DRS open on the home straight when he started his lap, and he also apparently had some like upshifting issues, so he lost a few tenths in a corner. So I think if he had everything perfectly nailed, I think Max would have been clear on qualifying. But then if it comes to the race, I think once Max pulled that like 2-second gap within the first 2 laps, I think it was just pretty much cruise control for him, which is copy whatever Mercedes do, because as long as you do that, you're not going to get done by a strategy. So it was pretty much straightforward for Red Bull in terms of Max. But then if you look at Checo, again, it's kind of becoming a pattern of struggle in qualifying, even though it may not be his fault this week, but struggle in qualifying and then just drag that car where it should be, or closer to where it should be through the race, because he's just such a great driver and he just knows where to position the car when to overtake. But also, like Joe said, when you're in a Red Bull and you're racing against a Haas or a Williams, you should just go by them in the blink of an eye, and it shouldn't be difficult. But he's still a great driver, and he's fair play to him coming 8th in the pit lane, but he definitely needs to start improving his qualifying to then fight up the top with Hamilton, Bottas and Max. But then if we go to Bottas, honestly, when he was told to pit, I was like, yes, go get the fastest lap. And then he was told to not get the fastest lap. I was like, honestly, Mercedes, just grow up. I was like, I was like cheering him on, like, please just get it. Because when they were saying he had 2 purple sectors for sector 1 and 2, I was like, don't slow down for the last sector, just keep going. But unfortunately, he slowed down. But I think that relationship between him and Mercedes has just deteriorated because they've just put Lewis Hamilton first, which it makes sense, but you've still got to treat your second driver as one of your best drivers and a driver, basically, but they just don't really care about him anymore. But yeah, I think when it comes to the weekend overall for the teams, Mercedes probably did have the better weekend just because Checo was just shit in qualifying.
Amazing.
Wait, can I argue with Josh's point about treating Bottas the same as Lewis?
Go for it. Have a little.
I kind of disagree. I disagree. As in, I think Bottas hasn't shown the pace that compared to Lewis since they were teammates. So I don't think personally that you can try and get somebody quicker than Lewis Hamilton by giving him resources when if he uses them, he would still be the same. He would still be slow. I think Toto Wolff is in his right mind to go and say, okay, let's focus on Lewis. You're just playing the team game here. Because again, as in if you look on across the garage of Red Bull, it's basically what they're doing there. Basically just putting Perez out to dry because of his poor performances and just putting everything into Max. I think if it was like Rosberg and Hamilton, I think that would be a completely different story because after the show, I think Rosberg said that there's a complete like slate, as in everything's going to be equal. I don't think Bottas went into Mercedes saying that because I think when Jenson Button signed for McLaren with Lewis Hamilton's teammates, he demanded to have equal rights to Lewis Hamilton, and I do not think Valtteri Bottas has had the right to have those rights to be equal to Lewis because of his performances.
I completely get what you mean. It's just Hamilton is clearly the better driver. He's clearly the faster, more experienced, and obviously better driver because he's won 7 world champions. But I just think as a team, I understand you want to prioritize a driver because they give you a better chance of getting more points and meaning better positions in the constructors and driver championships. But I just think teams should be more equal, more lenient to both their drivers. Otherwise, what's the point in having 2 drivers? Just have one, and then everyone can just focus solely on that one driver. So I just think, like when you bring upgrades, teams nowadays seem to bring upgrades to one car, see if it works, and then bring it to the next car, like a race later. Like just bring it to both, make it equal, make the car fair for both drivers. And obviously, you're always going to have a number 1 driver or a stronger driver within your team. Whereas I think in terms of being a team, as in just be equal. So like maybe 1 week, one driver goes out first and the other one gets a tow, then next week swap. It just makes sense in my head, but I can understand why teams don't, because they want to get points, be higher up, and get more money for the actual company and the team. But I think there's just an argument to both sides.
Go anymore, or we?
Oh no, I just Josh is probably told, but yeah, I just honestly think Bottas has lost those rights to having equal like slipstream, for example. As in like next week, I predict that Bottas will go out first to give Hamilton the slipstream, because again it'll be the same for Perez as well. So, but I understand Josh's point that everybody should be equal, because again there's no point of having a second driver. but I think it's just the way the game works in F1 that one driver is always going to be. I think there's the only team that I can think of, the only two teams that I think have don't have a number one driver is McLaren and Ferrari. And maybe Aston, but those are the three teams that have equal, I would say equal, what's the word, equal,
opportunities.
Equal opportunities and that. So Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, I just think that was a great debate.
No, get involved. Don't sit there and just host the thing. Get involved.
Oh, I think that most, as I said, most cars on the grid have a number one driver. Ferrari definitely have a number one. I'm sorry, Leclerc's definitely number one driver, and Sainz a support, in my opinion. But yeah, teams having number one drivers isn't a problem as long as it doesn't get too toxic. Bottas is definitely a number two driver. That's his job. That's what he's best at. I mean, it's sad, but he's a great number two driver. He gets podiums. He won't get race wins. He'll get the occasional race win when Hamilton messes up and Verstappen messes up. But he's a number two driver. Number two drivers are important and part of the sport. They've been part of the sport for years, and there's no need to get rid of them. So support drivers are good, and Bottas is a good support driver. But next year he'll be the number one driver at Alfa Romeo. So we'll see how he deals with that. Just speculation. But and also to back Perez, to be fair, he was bought into Red Bull because of him having some of the best racecraft on the grid. Yes, in qualifying he does sometimes struggle, but Max does get special treatment. But anyway, let's move on to talk about the McLaren versus Ferrari battle, which, to be honest, this weekend was pretty non-existent. I mean, first of all, Norris getting really unlucky in quali, didn't put them in good stead, and Ricciardo's Q3 lap wasn't amazing, putting him in 10th. And then you go to Ferrari and you have Leclerc in 5th and Sainz in 7th. Both did really well, Sainz especially, because he was complaining, and in his interview was talking about he's never lacked pace like that. So to salvage 7th is really impressive. But guys, what do you think about the battle between the two teams above the midfield but below the title fight?
Yeah, like you said, it was pretty non-existent in this race, but overall it's still pretty much alive. But yeah, I think it's pretty much obvious which team had the better weekend. With I think Ferrari finishing 5th and 7th, like you said. It's unfortunate for Sainz to not finish 6th because he got overtaken by Alonso at the end. But don't really know what actually happened there. I think because Leclerc just kept pulling away and just seemed to have pace that Sainz couldn't find. But I think that backs up your point with Ferrari's number one driver. But in terms of McLaren, it just wasn't their weekend. They just didn't have luck on their side during qualifying, and then just Ricciardo's just lack of pace in the car just showed itself. But then they did provide a good strategy for Lando to then somehow sneak a point, even though Checo did have to unfortunately basically destroy his tyre to get past him.
Literally Lando's fault.
But yeah, I think just to scrape a point from where they were is decent, but they just didn't have the pace this weekend, unfortunately. But I'm sure they'll be back stronger in Monza, and I'm sure also for Ferrari it's their home race, so they're hoping to be strong and not be as poor as last time they were there, when I think Charles and Vettel both retired, or one crashed and one retired. But yeah, so hopefully it'll be a bit different story for them at Monza this year.
Yeah, I think McLaren had a very, very dismal performance this week. I just don't think the car suited the track. But I think it will definitely be very strong at Monza, considering last time out Sainz got P2 when he was at McLaren. So I think McLaren will be able to pull back. I think it's 11 points or 11.5 points or whatever. But I think Ferrari looked pretty strong. They generally do look strong in low speed corner circuit and slightly high mid corner, like basically not much straights, which they do struggle at. But yeah, as Sainz, I think, had a problem with his engine. I think it was a problem with power, and Leclerc just did what he usually does and performs. But it was quite interesting that the fact that the Ferraris and also you could say the McLarens weren't challenging the Alpha Tauri of Gasly, which I was very surprised about.
Yeah, Gasly had a great race we'll come to talk about in a moment. But yeah, I'm not gonna lie, Norris, I didn't mention it earlier, but despite him getting knocked out because of 2 red flags, got really unlucky, Norris's pace in qualifying anyway was really poor. He scraped through in Q3, and the only reason he got through is because Vettel and Perez couldn't, Vettel's lap got compromised and Perez couldn't get round to do a lap. So that's the only reason he went through the first.
Norris got compromised as well, by the way, as well.
Yeah, but it's just his pace wasn't good anyway. Realistically, I don't think his pace in quali wasn't that great. So I don't think the race he definitely improved. He had some decent pace, but still not the Lando Norris we've seen so far this season. And despite a good race start, Ricciardo's race just ended up being pretty boring. Nothing really happens, not getting points, which isn't really good enough for a McLaren. I don't know how long we're going to have to keep saying, or I keep saying he's adjusting. He did at Renault. He takes a long time to adjust to the car, and that definitely is working against him at the moment. But yeah, Ferrari were superb, especially Charles Leclerc. But Leclerc is one of the most consistent drivers of the grid, and Sainz did well to bring it home. But let's move on to the 3-car fight. One of the teams in this fight got 0 points this weekend, so didn't perform at all. But let's talk about the 3As, Alpha Tauri, Aston Martin, and Alpine. Gasly, as we just talked about, unbelievable race, keeping Leclerc behind him, superb achievement. Tsunoda DNFing, unlucky. Quali wasn't incredible either. Then Vettel, of course, compromised in quali, and race he had a spin and just struggled a bit. Stroll just had like the most nothing race ever, 12th to 12th, very boring. Then you go to Alpine and you've got a revitalized Fernando Alonso, who just is amazing at race starts, starting 9th and finishing 6th, getting a car on the last lap as well. Rosberg said it after the race, you put him in the Mercedes, if Lewis wasn't there, I'll add, and he'd win you a championship, because he's still got it. Even in Alpine, he still has that drive determination. I thought it was superb. And then you had Ocon, who had a solid race, 8th to 9th, did drop a position, but some decent points for the team. But yeah, let's talk about these 3 teams. Who do you think did well? Who didn't? Let's talk about it.
Well, in terms of both drivers, you'd have to say Alpine had the better weekend with both of them finishing in points. But then if you actually look at the points they've got, you then go to AlphaTauri because just P4 finishing managed to get more points. But I think even though they did get P4 with Gasly, he must have been really, really bored, because he literally had no one near him the whole time, because he's like 30 seconds behind Bottas, and then Leclerc somehow just couldn't find the pace to go anywhere near him. So in terms of his race, he's probably bored out of his mind, but I'm sure he'll take it. P4, it's a good result for his team, so I think they'll be happy. And then obviously just unlucky for Tsunoda. I think his lack of experience definitely showed throughout the weekend, with lack of pace to even get out of Q1. So so that was pretty much Tsunoda just doing what he always does. But then with the Alpines, I think, like you said, Fernando Alonso just looks back to his best self, or just back in F1 where he belongs. Somehow putting that car in great positions in sixth. But I found it interesting during the race where I think towards the start of both the stints of their tyres, Ocon was like, "Oh, he's so slow, he needs to get out of my way." And then it'll get towards the end of the stint, and Alonso will be like 5 or 6 seconds ahead of Ocon. So don't really know what was going on there. I just thought it was quite funny. But then I think you said Alfa Romeo was the next one. I think
Aston Martin.
Oh, Aston Martin. Okay, there's too many A's. Aston Martin. I think obviously unlucky for Vettel. He just couldn't really make up for it, and then obviously the spin didn't help. And then interestingly, Stroll was just stuck behind Russell the whole race. Like, I just literally just stuck behind his bumper the whole race, just staring at it. I was like, "Are you gonna try and make a move, or just not gonna bother?" It's like he just really wasn't interested in this race because he didn't look like he made a move. So for them, it was a bit disappointing, but I don't think there was much they could have done because I don't think they had the pace either. So yeah, definitely a better weekend for Alpine.
Yeah, I think Gasly was very impressive. I think there's going to be at some points, I don't know, in the near future that he's going to wanting that Red Bull seat. And if he doesn't, he'll move to a different team. I think for me, he's good enough to be in the Red Bull. I think he's got over his sketchy patch where he's basically rushed into the Red Bull seat. So I'm hoping he gets moved to Red Bull at some point, but that's probably unlikely because Helmut Marko doesn't like promoting, I'm going to say Red Bull rejects, but it's not really because they're part of their kind of program. I think then Tsunoda, he's been awful. Let's be fair. I know he's a rookie, but he's been awful the whole entire season. I think the reason he's in F1 is because of Honda. Just because just because Honda wanted a Japanese driver in the sport. I think that's the reason he's there. I think it's a bit, and obviously a bit too soon for him. I think he should have stayed in F2 to develop a bit more. And then Alpine, Alonso, as you said, Sam, I think I do agree with you. For me, he's probably in the top 3 drivers on the grid. He's very fast, very good in qualifying, and very good in the race. Even though he says he's still looking for those 2/10 with that Alpine car. I think he's done reasonably well in Netherlands. And then Ocon, I think it's just a good performance for him, as he didn't before Hungary had really bad results, so he did very well. And then the Aston Martins got lapped twice. It was I would say kind of a shambolic performance from them in terms of the way that, as Josh said, Stroll didn't do anything, just like looking at the rear of a Williams car. Maybe just trying to look at the sponsors. And then obviously Vettel had that mini spin. Trying to get past. Who was trying to get past?
It was Russell. I think it was an Alfa Romeo, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, Giovinazzi, I think it was. Oh, or was that Kubica? Not Kubica.
One of them.
Yeah, it's one of them. But yeah, it was. I think at the moment we call it the 3 A's, but it should be 2 because I think AlphaTauri have shown they're not track dependent anymore. They can really perform when it's only Gasly. And
we need 2 Gaslys in the team.
Yeah. If Gasly likes that track, they're going to be right up there, challenging McLaren. And then the Alpine cars were very strong. It's just the Aston Martins. I don't think that you can. I think we have to now put them with Williams and Alfa Romeo. No,
that is hard.
That's a take, that is.
Yeah, that is a hot take, but I think what summed up Stroll's race the best was his conversation with his engineer when they told him to pit, and the race engineer was like, "You need to press the OK button," and he was like, "I have," and he's like, "No, you haven't," and he's like, I've pressed pit confirm. That's what the button is. That is the OK button." Or something along those lines, and the engineer was just like left embarrassed because the engineer is just like waffling, and Stroll is right. But yeah, he could have probably drawn like a realistic, a proper good drawing of the Williams, the back of the Williams car, as Ted Kravitz said. That did overtake him when he retired, so it's a win for Stroll in my eyes. But yeah, let's talk about the last A and Williams. We're going to group them together now. I'm just going to put Haas in a category on their own. We can talk about that in a sec. But let's talk about Alfa Romeo and Williams. Neither team getting points. I mean, generally that's not a surprise, but after Williams all of a sudden getting quite a few points recently, it's a tiny bit of a surprise. But yeah, Alfa Romeo, first of all, Kubica coming in did really well. Starting 16th, first of all, beating both the Haasers, and then finishing 15th, getting an overtake on the last lap on Latifi, a guy who got loads of points the other week. So that's impressive. So he had a good drive. Giovinazzi basically got really unlucky with a puncture. His pace wasn't great anyway. He dropped very quickly, but it's great quality, so that's all that matters. But yeah, he's probably not going to be in that seat next year. And then moving on to Williams, Russell basically just stayed where he was. He didn't move. To get a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane is a bit naive, to be honest, for someone as consistent as Russell. And then retiring was kind of the icing on the cake for quite a bad day. And then in terms of Latifi, he just was pretty rubbish this weekend, I'm not going to lie. I mean, he threw his car into the pits at like massive speeds in qualifying. And then in the race, got overtaken by a guy who only races with one hand and hasn't driven a proper F1 car for 11 years, as he says, as Williams was just about survival. So let's talk about these two teams, how they compared. Any highlights for you guys?
I think Williams' highs of like Spa and what was the other Hungary have come back to now slap them back into reality of where they should be. I think, yeah, as you agree, I think Russell was he could have got into Q3. I think he had the pace, but I would personally think Norris would have beaten him. But I think getting a 5-second penalty, as you said, this only happens in F1 games. I think it's just very stupid from a driver who's going to sign for Mercedes. I think we now have to put him to a very high standard now, considering he's going to sign for a Mercedes. And then Latifi's just been Latifi. It's just there because of the money coming in for Williams. He crashed out in qualifying and then just didn't do much in the race. I can't remember him doing an overtake or anything. I do. He did a very nice overtake that Jenson Button was very happy with. But then
National supervisor.
Yeah, as the senior supervisor there. And then Robert Kubica, very good to see him back into the sport. And my eyes just did better than Giovinazzi in the way that has again driving with, I would say, one hand and a very impaired. I think it's his right hand that he damaged, very impaired right hand, from a rallying crash, I think in 2011. So yeah, it's a Giovinazzi, as you said, had impressive qualifying, but then had Giovinazzi pace in the race, just woeful. And I think, as I keep on saying on this podcast yesterday and a couple of days ago and today, that I think his seat is very numbered. I think there'll be a driver confirmed very soon as Alex Albon, Alex Albon might have that seat. As we haven't done Haas yet, have we?
No, we're going to move on to them in a second, Joe.
Oh, okay. But yeah, that's my brutal discussion on Williams and Alfa Romeo.
There's not really much more you can add to that, really, is there, Joe? I think the only real point that I wanted to make was directed at Williams. There's just like Joe said, it was just a reality check. Or they shouldn't have really been up there in the last few races, but they're now back to where they belong. But my other point was I just wish they weren't here this week, because it just completely ruined Norris and other people's Q2. So I was like, just go away. But other than that, I think Joe's pretty much covered everything that happened this weekend with those two teams.
Yeah, I think Alfa Romeo have quite disappointed me this year. I thought they'd get a few more points, and I think that their drivers aren't necessarily getting the best out of their car. If you combined Giovinazzi's qualifying with Raikkonen's race pace, they'd get a lot more points. But the problem is Raikkonen's not great in quali, and then in the race is decent, and Giovinazzi's decent in qualifying, but then the race is pretty poor. So it's really frustrating, and I bet their team principal is pulling his hair out. But yeah, Kubica, well done, mate. You're a top man. I was really excited to see you back in the sport, and maybe he's an outside chance for the Alfa Romeo seat. He never denied it. So maybe they'll go for Bottas and Kubica, which would be a proper blast of the past. But let's talk about the best team on the grid, Haas. What a team! I mean, to sum up a discussion of the team, I mean, we're basically just going to say they're rubbish, and how like Mazepin's just like a psycho and Schumacher's just like doing the best he can in a rubbish car. The discussion I want to have with the team, because they got 0 points, they came DNF'd and 18th, like not very interesting, is there's a proper inter-team feud there, isn't there? Because you had in qualifying Mazepin complaining, as I said earlier, about Schumacher going out first to do a hot lap when it should have been his turn or something. I don't quite remember. It's something like that. And then in the race, Mazepin pulled out a maneuver which he's known for in Formula 2, where he almost threw Schumacher into a wall, into the pit wall on one of the laps, trying to defend against him. Which, to be honest, right, when you're defending for the bottom two places, there's just no point almost like threatening to put your teammate in a wall. What do you make on this feud between the two drivers? Schumacher, I reckon, wants out and is trying to get that Alfa Romeo seat. What do you guys think of it?
I just think it was just bound to happen at one point. Mazepin's just big head was going to explode at one point and just cause mayhem within the team. I think the appointment of him was just the wrong move from the start. But like you said,
money.
Yeah, money. But still, who cares? Get someone else. But I think, like you said, he almost pretty much forced Schumacher into the pit lane, not just into the wall, but into the actual pit lane. When like watching it on back, I was like, what is he doing? Just it's so dangerous, and it's your own teammate. There's just no point. But like I said, it was just bound to happen at some point. Even though Schumacher seems like such a lovely bloke, but obviously he's just going to getting frustrated with his teammate, and probably frustrated with how bad the car is as well. It just doesn't help the situation. But it was just definitely going to boil over at one point, and it just happened to be this weekend.
Yeah, I think this teammate, this team gets more of to turn into a Formula 3 car the more it goes round the track. Well, I think next week we'll actually turn into an F1 car because it's high speed. But I think the fuse between Mazepin and Mick Schumacher doesn't really surprised me, but I think also I think one of them's going out because as in there's always been a fuse at Haas with Grosjean and Magnussen. I don't. Do you know if they signed on for next season?
I think that I don't know.
Because if this fuse is happening with 8 races or 9 races left, and there's a contract that's based, I forgot the principal called. Gunther Steiner has basically said, "Oh, you have to perform. One of you is going to have this contract, and we're going to employ somebody else in F2 that can actually do a competent job because you're the rookie." Mazepin hasn't been good. He's been dangerous, been reckless. He's been a meme. He's been, I don't know. I can't be too, and I can't really be too brutal to Mick Schumacher because he's basically been, the only reason he's in that car is because I don't think he could get into Alfa Romeo at the time last season. So I feel sorry for Mick Schumacher. I hope he goes to a different team because I think whoever is going to be Mazepin's teammate, if he's like I don't know if it's like Paul Chair or Juan Ji Zhou or any of those drivers, or even Alex Albon, they're gonna fight with Mazepin because that's just his personality on track and off track.
Neither driver has signed on for next year. I have just looked it up, but yeah, that team is just an absolute mess, and it needs sorting out. Schumacher is in the seat because, admittedly, he won Formula 2, so he is kind of in the seat on merit, but he's in it because they bought in a sponsor who gave them money, but their request was we need a German driver. So that's one of the reasons. Should have bought in Hulkenberg, but they bought in Mick Schumacher, and then Mazepin's in the sport because his dad's rich. Unlike Latifi, who's in the sport because he's a quality driver and is sick in F2. But Mazepin is in the sport because of money, and he is just, even in his interview after the race, he had to leave the little comment at the end saying, he said, another clean race for me as well. And it's like, you almost put your teammate in a wall. Like, how is that clean? Admittedly, he didn't hit it. Like, he didn't hit anyone, but he just thinks he's so good, and he's just not. There are times that I've found him likable, but I just haven't recently, and he'll be in the sport for years. That's my worry, and the team won't.
Yeah, as I do agree on that one. I think I would say I've got to say Tsunoda. I know I'm putting Tsunoda under the bus, but it's kind of like that. Just due to Honda wanting, I think before their contract ends, they wanted a Japanese driver in the car. Who's that really good NASCAR? I can't remember. Is it Sato? I think it is Sato. They should put him in. He's like 43, but used to race in F1 in the 2000s. But yeah, sorry, I got a bit off track. But yeah, I think him, Tsunoda and Mazepin are in that bracket of kind of contract obligated with like money, and yeah, I don't think those two should be in the sport personally. I think you could put any driver and do a better job.
To be fair to Tsunoda, when I watched him in F2, he did have a lot of highlights, and you could see there was so much potential there. Like, there were maneuvers he pulled out that were just brilliant, and there were times where he did look like the best driver in Formula 2, but you could see that it was very raw talent and it needed to be refined. He's I've seen someone on Twitter saying he's been the most disappointing rookie there's been in F1 for years because of the hype around him before the season started, and bar one or two races he hasn't lived up to that. Admittedly today DNFing, so really like harsh to judge, but apparently he's going to sign on. He's going to sign on at Monza, supposedly, or before Monza, which is where half the teams are going to announce their lineups for next year. So maybe next season will be different. I hope it is because he's a driver I like, but Mazepin, the feelings aren't reciprocated. I just want him out of the sport. But if they leave the sport, Haas leave the sport, and that means Günther Steiner leaves the sport, and we don't want Günther Steiner to leave the sport. So,
sorry, Sam, but I think there's rumours that the Volkswagen company and Porsche, I think another one as well, are looking into the sport because of the engine regulation change, which I think happens in 2025. I know that's like 4 years away, but I think if Porsche or Volkswagen buy Haas, I think that could be there's also rumors that this is the worst case scenario ever, that Mazepin's dad buys Haas, and then basically Mazepin's Lance Stroll for like 7. I don't know. Yeah.
Imagine Volkswagen by Haas, and you have Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Volkswagen. That'd be amazing. I hope they design it around the Beetle. That would be amazing. Just get the Volkswagen Beetle going around.
Yeah, it's the Volkswagen group, so they could put any of that. They could even put Lamborghini. I think Volkswagen are part of the Lamborghini group. So
they need the Beetle. They need the Beetle in the sport. But anyway, and that long discussion about the teams that Josh wasn't a part of, but Josh, you can be a part of the driver of the day. So you can kick us off. Who was your driver of the day for Zandvoort?
Well, unfortunately, you two have chosen probably the most obvious or better driver to choose from. But I still think my choice for the little amount of time he had and for the 11-year break that he's had, I think Kubica was my driver of the day, just in the fact that he came in, I think, Saturday morning. He had one practice session on a completely new track that I don't think he's probably raced at in F1. Well, definitely not in F1, but he might have done it in other categories. But I think for him to qualify where he did and finish 15th and overtake Latifi at the end, who's been driving this whole season, I think it just shows what kind of a driver he is and how good he is, even though he's only got one working hand. But I think for me it was Kubica, just because of how experienced and skilled he is, just to jump in the car really late and still manage to do reasonably well in the car.
Yeah, mine's I think Pierre Gasly, just brilliant performance, P4 and then P4 in the race as well. I think he's arguably, I think at the moment, he's very consistent, and he should be on Red Bull's radar to go to that Red Bull seat if Perez doesn't perform.
He signed on for next year, Joe. He signed on for
I know that was coming at some point.
Yeah, Perez has signed on for next year, and he's also my driver of the day. He was superb today after his team messed him up. Definitely nothing to do with him. His qualifying is exceptional for Red Bull. I don't know what you're talking about. Bear in mind he started in the pits. Finishing P8 is really good, especially bear in mind he had to pit early, which admittedly was his fault because he did flat spot the tyres locking up. But makes it even more impressive, the recovery drive. Made some brilliant overtakes. Lando tried to put him in a wall, but he came through that and he got past him. He actually overtook another car. He overtook Ocon even after Norris decided to take up all the flooring of the car because he's a maniac. But yeah, he was really good on the race. He was the most entertaining thing about Sunday. And yeah, he's my driver of the day. Special shout out to Gasly, who Joe has mentioned, Alonso, and Kubica, who Josh has mentioned. Kubica driver. I was so excited. I put in the chat, our chat, when he was announced, like, so excited because he's a driver I really like. He was unlucky that the team he came back with after his injury was Williams, who were going through like the worst spell. And he's a driver that before his crash, I thought had the potential to win a championship. I loved watching him. Clips of him, I still watch clips of him. He was one of my favourite drivers, and it was sick to see him return. And he's going to get that Alfa Romeo seat. That sums up and wraps up our podcast reviewing the Zandvoort Dutch Grand Prix. A lot to say about each driver and even their futures in the sport, as well as reviewing the race. Next week, we are in Monza for the Italian GP. We've got 3 in a row. This is the last one of that, last of the triple header, a track which is brilliant. And always provides drama, saying that there'll probably be like nothing happening now. I said this, but yeah, we'll have a preview for that later in the week. Thank you for watching and listening. Make sure to like, subscribe, download, whatever you need to do, and we'll see you next time. Cheers, guys.